Well, good afternoon. I'm happy to be with you today. But when you go to any Milken Institute event, you should also assume that we're going to ask you at least a few quiz questions. Though I start with one here, and it will be interesting to see how the group does on it. So it was the late 1800s. And in 1893, women had the right to vote in only one country in the world. You might not remember that, but those of us that were around in 1893 remember it vividly. Today, in 195 nations in the world, how many of those countries do women have the right to vote? Have we gone from 1 to 57, 1 to 112, 1 to 125, 1 to 158, or 1 to 193? You have 30 seconds to talk it over with people at your table, and only one vote per table. Okay, time's up, time's up. How many think we went from 1 to 57? Any tables voting for 57? Amazing. How about to 112? Okay, a few. How about to 125? You know, in multiple choice tests, it's usually C, right? Okay. How about 158? This table is so enthusiastic. 4 people at one table voted. Okay, and what about 193 out of 195? Anyone want to vote for that? Okay, let's take a look at what the result was. Okay, so we had a high percentage get that. You've underestimated change in the world. Let's take a look at the second one. Let's go to Malaysia for a moment here. Today, 8% of Malaysians are age 60 or older, so 8% of the population. Based on United Nations projections, what percent of Malaysians will be over 60 by 2050? So yes, in order to be over 60 by 2050, you have to be at least 28 today. So what percent? 10, 15, 18, 20? What percent do you think? We're going to give you a much shorter, only 15 seconds on this one. Okay, time's up. Time's up. A, 10%. We're going to go from 8 to 10%. 1, okay. 15. Now, you can't score if you don't vote. 18%. 20%. This table is fantastic. Everyone is their own table. Okay. 25%, 1 in 4. Okay, number one answer was 20. Number 2 was 25. Substantial change in demographics. The correct answer is... So you did very, very well on that. Let's look. Let's take us to 2050 and let's look at the whole world. That we're estimating that there'll be 2 billion people by 2050 now, 1 billion by next year, and one of those 2 billion in 2050, 1 billion will be in Asia. So if we look at this market and think about it as a market, spending power today of over 60 globally is projected to be $15 trillion a year, would make it the world's second largest economy, just interacting with people over 60 from that standpoint. So the topic, one of my favorite topics, is building meaningful lives. And I broke it into 5 parts so we can move quickly. But first, what is a meaningful life? In understanding this question of what is a meaningful life, when you think about your co-workers, your family today, this is one of the major challenges in the world, is particularly as you go to younger people, they want to know, will this bring a meaning in life? Is the job or your company providing services that are providing meaning to the world, not just to them? And so this brings us to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and stepping back and thinking of these challenges in financial terms. In 08-09, during the crisis, so many families, even in the middle class, were essentially faced with this issue at the very bottom of the pyramid. Could they cover costs for housing? Could they pay for food? Could they take care of their family's medical costs? Once you've achieved that level, you can move up. Is it safe? Is it safe to live in this part of the world? Is it safe to live in your community? Then if we can achieve those 2 levels, we then focus on, does anyone care about you? Does anyone love you or even like you? What about your family? What about your friends? And then as you move up, self-esteem. And for many parts of the world, self-esteem is often associated with your job, your occupation, what you do. And so often you're defined by what that is. Hopefully that job allows you to move to that level of the pyramid. And then finally, the self-actualization level in Maslow's pyramid. Whether you study this in high school or college, you're focused on it today. It has as much importance today as it did when it was first put forth. Let's take a look at the world in many ways. So if we went back to the 1950s, most jobs did not require a skill. Maybe 20% of all jobs required a skill, and just the willingness to work hard was enough that you could achieve, quote, a middle-class life in that society. Today, throughout the world, the question is often asked, what is your skill? What can you do? And so we're looking at a job market totally different than the market of a couple of generations ago. Fear of automation is often related to your level of high school education, college education. And as we look at the percent of the probability that your job might be automated, there's a direct correlation to the level of education that you have. As we look at the Asian workforce, for example, you have a large percentage of workers today that use data at least once a week. 2/3 are required to work with a higher volume of data than 3 years ago. And 80% of workers in Australia, Singapore, India, China consider themselves to be relatively illiterate as it comes to data. And so the challenge in a world of analyzing this data, whether you're in the money management business or almost any business in the future, is the skill set to understand data, with the access to data being a commodity. One of the things we looked at a couple years ago at our global conference in Los Angeles is, why do people play video games? So as we're focused on meaningful lives, one of our speakers, the CEO of Electronic Arts, Andrew Wilson from Australia, answered it this way. Once you get past air, water, shelter, kind of moving up Maslow's triangle, you get to social connections, a sense of belonging. You get to self-esteem, so you can see they've been studying the video game player and this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Overcoming challenges, building self-worth, and you get to self-actualization. We are providing self-actualization for a great many of our players. So think about it. My children want to play a video game against LeBron James in basketball today. They cannot compete on the course or on the playing field in soccer, basketball with professional athletes, but their hand-eye coordination might allow them to succeed in their world of a video game and be the best player in the world from that standpoint. And so I had never seen that analysis done of why people play video games, but it's an interesting idea of the satisfaction. And we should never forget that the highest grossing movie of all time by far is a movie called Avatar, which was essentially about an individual who was paralyzed from the waist down and became an avatar, and eventually he became the avatar. Let's look, in thinking about meaningful lives, at wealth patterns in the world. This data comes from Credit Suisse. So if you look at the United States today, you have a very interesting correlation. It has the highest of this group, percentage of its population, with a net worth under $10,000. And alongside Australia, we don't have Singapore, which would be the highest, but has the highest percentage of its population with a net worth over $1 million. So the issue of rich and poor, focusing on a meaningful life, the challenges where almost 30% of your population has a net worth under $10,000 in an economy where per capita income is around $60,000. Let's take a look at how this compares to some countries here in Asia as a comparison. So you can see here, for the most part, most of the countries, even though there's been large wealth accumulations and large percentage of the population have accumulated wealth in some countries, in China even today, or Malaysia, still a very small percent. That's measured in millions in China, but a small percentage of the population has a net worth over $1 million. And you can see the enormous differential that occurs between what is median and what is average income as we focus on it, and dramatic drops in the percentage of people in China that have a net worth under $10,000. So we could look at it as 62%. But on the other hand, you could look at almost 40% of every adult in China now has a net worth over $10,000. So let's focus on finance for a couple of minutes, investing in human capital. A large percent of your group works in the financial service industries. And I've discussed with many of you individually over the years this little formula I wrote down in 1965, and just the importance of finance in bringing prosperity, and we could, in this talk, refer to it as creating meaningful lives, creating jobs in what you want to achieve. But the importance of finance, this FT, different forms of access to capital, serving as a multiplier effect on human capital, human potential, the world's largest asset, social capital, rule of law, creditor rights, and others, and real assets, the things that you analyze on a balance sheet from that standpoint. And as we deployed these new instruments, and you could look at this period of time, and I've spoken to many of you over the years about it, the most important time and the creation of modern capital markets occurred in 1974. And you could see the dramatic change that occurred between large companies and small companies, Prior to 1974 in America, you had pretty much the same growth rate between large companies. In this case, we were looking at investment-grade companies and non-investment-grade companies. But as access to capital evened out across all sectors of the economy, and young entrepreneurs, those with ability, had the same access to capital, with the markets fully open by 1983, you saw a dramatic change occur. And in the last 30 years of the 20th century in the United States, more than 60 million jobs were created by small and medium businesses versus -4 by larger investment-grade companies. And still throughout Asia, if you look at China and other countries, most of the access to capital has been given to larger, often government-related, which inhibits in many ways the growth of job creation. Our Center for Financial Markets has many efforts around the world, promote financial market education, understanding access to capital, strengthening these markets, and creating new securities and financial markets to solve them areas of society. One of the ones I just want to highlight to you today is we've been very focused on Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the entire growth of the world's population is going to be. How do we create a critical mass of individuals working for governments that are financial experts, that can be a counterparty to you in investments, and can spur development in their countries? Our solution was to create this intern educational program with International IFC, International Finance Corp, a group of the World Bank, where we bring to the United States a group of individuals who are committed to work for their governments, who've graduated college, are picked as the leaders. We then cull from that group. They spend about a year between internships and going to school, returning them as financial experts, knowledgeable in financial markets, that could be your counterparties. Earlier today, we've had discussions with the government here in Singapore about the potential of bringing these groups and creating this with one of the universities here in Singapore. Human capital, human potential, there's 3 ways to increase it. One is education. Another one is immigration. The U.S. has probably been the greatest beneficiary in the last century to many of the best and brightest from around the world coming there to go to school. Singapore in recent years. And lastly, health. Steve Jobs probably provided the best quote on this. Innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars. When we came up with the Mac, IBM was outspending us 100 to 1. It's about the people, their talent, and how you lead. If we look at the United States, it is really not thought of. There's many other areas that have been thought of. But education was the founding strength of the United States in so many ways. In addition to creditor rights, property rights, Bill of Rights, rule of law, religious freedom. But between 1870 and 1950, Americans added 1 year of education per decade. Amazing, never occurred in the history of the world. And therefore, by 1960, the United States was the most educated country in the world. It exceeded by 2 years, every other country in the education of their citizens with universal education. Since 1960, the U.S. has made little to no progress, and other countries like Singapore have now caught and passed the United States. The number one thing that we discovered and that students in high school in the United States have, they only rank in one area, self-confidence. So you can go to Korea and ask a student, are you good in math? And they'll say, I'm okay. They would rank in the 99th percentile in the United States. So let's look at what the United States has done. So we picked Beverly Hills High, which is not too far from where the Milken Institute is located in Southern California and Santa Monica. And they rank in the United States in the 87.7% percentile in mathematics. Now let's see how they would do if it was in Canada. Those same test scores would put them in the 46th percentile, and since we're here in Singapore, of course, they would rank in the 34th percentile. So it's no wonder that the U.S. ranks #1 in self-confidence. We've lowered the ratings so much that everyone succeeds. The real strength of Asia, and something we've been focused on, particularly over the last 20 years, is this commitment to the middle class, that the middle class has made to the education of their children. So as you look at middle class spending in the United States today, you'll see 50% is going to housing and transportation, and only 2% to the supplemental education of their children. Much of the middle class in the United States is house poor. And even if they wanted to spend money on the education of their children, cannot afford it. In Asia, the middle class in 11 Asian countries, in a study done by CLSA, #1 expenditure was food, #2, supplemental education. 80% of all the children in Korea go to school before or after school. 55% of all the children in the middle class in China now go to an English language school, in addition to their regular schooling. And you can see, if you look at housing and transportation in Asia, it is not much different than what they're investing in education. In the United States, it would be 25-1. And in Asia, in the average of these 11 countries, it'd be 1-1. And lastly, the element of health. And you can't go to a Milken Institute event without us reminding you that 50% of all economic growth in the world in the last 2 centuries can be traced to improvements in health and medical research. And the astounding fact that 11 million years of evolution, but 4 million years of human evolution on this planet only resulted in an 11-year increase in life expectancy. 4 million years, 11-year increase from 20 to 31. And in the last less than 120 years has produced a 41-year increase in average life expectancy on the planet. Understanding and predicting this would occur, you'd have been a heavy investor in East Asia, where life expectancy in 2 generations increased by more than 70%. One recent book on factfulness pointed out that one of the great ideas that's occurred over particularly the last 40 years has been investing in women's education. 40% of the workforce today in the world is female. An astounding move from 65% of girls in the world that were in school to 90% in the world by 2015 versus 92% for boys. Amazing change. And today, as we look at the data, in 2/3 of the countries, slightly more women attend universities than men in these areas. And particularly in Asia, you find this as occurrence. Women equality, dramatic changes in what's occurred in that area. As we look at economic growth, a substantial increase in Asia can occur in this Asian Pacific region by looking at more movement to equality between men and women. Disruptive technologies. One of the main areas and fears of individuals in focusing on creating meaningful lives is the potential risk to their careers and the disruption from technology. Here are just 20 areas we could cover. Today, I'm only going to touch on 3 or 4 of them. Let's start with agriculture. While we're meeting here at this time upstairs on the 20th floor is a discussion related to food, the dramatic change in food tech, and what's occurring around the world. And if you look at productivity at its most extreme today, deploying that throughout the world would have the potential of eliminating 500 million jobs. In the United States in 1800, 95% of the population was involved in some type of food production. By 1900, it was down to 40%, and today, 1.5%. Let's take a look at one of these warehouses that's fully operational right now in China.
The Chinese government has been funding scientists like Professor Yang Qichong to research vertical farming.
由于在可控环境下进行生产，所以它的空气环境也是比较亲切的。我们能做到不用任何农药和化学制剂。
Here's how it works. Seeds are placed in sponges and grow up to 17 days. Then the plants are moved a few feet away to a nursery area, and finally into a finishing area where roots dangle in beds of fertilized water until the produce is ready for harvest.
Because our container is climate controlled, it allows us to do a full harvest 26 times a year. And a typical farm can only rotate their land anywhere between 4 to 6 times.
So able to harvest 4 times or 6 times as many times a year using substantially less water, and not necessarily the #1 tourist spot for people in the United States, Newark, New Jersey. The largest vertical farm is now operating. And it's not just agriculture. In energy, dramatic changes are occurring in the movement away from coal and carbon-based energy, and the fact today that solar power is cheaper than coal, and we're looking at India and China particularly. Almost 40% of all the investment in solar and other non-carbon-based energy is scheduled to occur just in those 2 countries alone. The concern of the United States pulling out of the Paris Accords has had little to no effect on the world, and even less effect on the United States. When I throw something in the wrong trash bag at my house, I get a 20-minute lecture from my wife. I can't explain to her that we've pulled out of the Paris Accords and we no longer need to recycle. And my grandchildren would disown me if I threw it into the wrong sector. One of the things we've discovered here is looking at this issue of conservation, environment, and also taking care of the human being and dealing with the challenges. And so if you look at China today, an area where if you went to medical school 30 years ago, you never studied obesity and you never studied diabetes, today 15% of all women in China, today in parts of that country, are obese, same with men, and China now has an epidemic of diabetes and will have the most people with diabetes in the entire world as you look at that challenge. So dealing with this challenge, changing the food chain, sequencing your biome, there's enormous potential. The environmental reactions throughout Asia, you can read them about in the newspaper on a weekly basis as people are focused on these issues, and governments themselves. This has become priority 1 for many of the governments. It's interesting when you look at many of the things that would reverse global warming, and this book Drawdown lists the top 10, and if you go to the top 20, you'll find that almost half of them relate just to food. So dealing with food and those areas, and dealing with food security has the same effect on not only improving the lives for human beings, but dramatically improving the environment. The ability to grow meat in a petri dish is a reality in the world today. Let's take a look.
Would you eat this? It's meat, but I guarantee you it's like no meat you've ever seen before. That's because this stuff was grown from cells in a lab.
Clean meat is meat grown by cell culture rather than grown by an animal. From a scientific perspective, it's awe-inspiring.
Lab-grown or clean meat is slaughter-free and potentially more eco-friendly because it uses less land, water, and energy. At least, that's the promise. Okay, we know what you're thinking.
That's nasty.
Ugh, doesn't sound right.
I'm not really into like lab-made things. It's unnatural.
It just seems off.
But if the scientists growing this stuff can overcome the ick factor, clean meat could help feed our growing population in more ethical and sustainable ways.
People will get used to clean meat in a hurry if it tastes right, if it feels right. If it doesn't, it's going to be a monumental thing to overcome.
The first ever lab-grown burger, which was unveiled in 2013, cost around $330,000 to grow. At Finless Foods, they've gotten as far as croquettes, which contain their fish, but also a whole lot of potato, and that's largely due to cost.
When we first started this project, we created our initial prototype, our fish croquettes that we made back in September. That was about $19,000 per pound. Since then, we've come down to about $7,000 per pound and are continuing to drop it.
So if just Finless Foods and other startups can successfully scale up, we'll soon have lab-grown meat that could be more sustainable and certainly more ethical than the stuff from factory farms. As long as you're okay with it looking like this.
So I know Impossible Meats is coming to Singapore in the next few months, and the dramatic technology, more than 3,000 firms around the world turning tomatoes into tuna or salmon, chicken, etc. This is a reality today in many parts of the world. Half the pharmaceuticals in the United States are shot into animals that you eat, pesticides, etc. And the dramatic positive effects on the environment are with us. Well, what about disruptions in finance? Most of you don't remember 1968-69 when I first went to Wall Street, and we had fixed commissions. It cost 1% commission for every dollar you bought in equities. So today, if you wanted to buy 5 shares of Berkshire Hathaway, it would cost you $3.95. Back $1 million, $1.4 million in Berkshire Hathaway would have cost you $14,000 to $15,000. A significant disruption if you're in the equity business. What about managing money? Dramatic changes in the movement to passive ETFs, away from active management, lower fees, etc., or technology in the way of investing. And what about accessing your bank accounts, paying bills, etc.? As we look at the United States versus China, for example, the idea that they would ever have the same bank branches in Africa, India, and some of these other places and involved will never occur in that way. As it relates to medicine, we've entered this new age, an age of immunology, energizing your immune system to fight disease, precision medicine, knowing what will work for you before we give it, genomics, powerful diagnosis, all that has been fueled by the cost of sequencing the genome. First time cost $3 billion. Today, less than $1,000. It took a decade, and now it occurs in less than an hour. And what about surgery? Well, minimally robotic surgery, less trauma, less blood, less period of time in the hospital, shorter, etc. The first one that really occurred in the United States occurred in 1992, but it took almost 10 years for it to be achieved widespread, particularly due to resistance from surgeons, many of who were going to lose their job by not becoming robotic surgeons. It has expanded, and today, even robotic surgery is facing a challenge coming from focused ultrasound, non-invasive surgery. So if you've seen those science fiction movies, it is a reality today. You can go to the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. It's an outpatient treatment. It's now being used for Parkinson's and others, and essentially using sound waves today to clean your body out of bad cells, the same as you clean your teeth. What about a pathologist or a radiologist versus the computer? Health systems such as Geisinger, that represents 4 million people in the United States, all of their CAT scans or CT scans from that standpoint and MRIs are first read by a computer today rather than a pathologist. So if I'm in Australia, one of the focuses in Australia is what about skin cancer, melanoma? Let's see what's happening on that front.
AI and robotics are making advances across the healthcare industry, from genetic testing and robotic surgery to cancer research and data collection. Soon enough, you may even run into some AI in the exam room.
Finding the melanoma is like trying to find the needle in the stack of needles.
Dermatologist Roberto Novoa is using an AI algorithm to help identify skin cancer.
It's basically comparing that lesion to the hundreds of thousands of other lesions that it's looked at.
The technology is an experimental mobile version of an algorithm that was modified by a team of Stanford grad students.
What we've built here is an algorithm that, using a single picture, can distinguish between benign and malignant skin conditions.
AI expert Sebastian Thrun led their team.
So what this can do is it can bring diagnostics to your home. Just take out your phone, take a little image, and get as good a diagnostics as you would get if you go to the doctor.
So how did they do it? Oddly enough, it all started with dogs. Thousands and thousands of them.
The way we train these algorithms is we show them many example cases from a particular object class. So for instance, in the case of dogs, we'd show lots of examples of dogs. And then we would test it and understand how effective it is at recognizing dogs by showing it new examples that it's never seen before. A couple of dermatologists approached us and they said, listen, if artificial intelligence can distinguish between hundreds of breeds of dogs, it might be able to do something for skin conditions.
In a test, the algorithm matched the performance of 21 board-certified dermatologists. It was also much faster, scanning skin images at about 200 times the rate of a human.
With sufficient data, I think that they will outperform the majority of humans.
So it won't be long before you can hit an app on your, quote, iPhone, with the idea that this AI algorithm has seen 500,000 melanomas, more than any living person has ever seen, to identify it. Lastly, demographics. As we think about demographics, as the chart or the question I asked you earlier about Malaysia, last year in the United States had the lowest birth rate in the history of the country. In the 1950s, 200 out of 1,000 women of childbearing age, 1 in 5, had a baby every year. Last year, it was 60. And if we look at it on an absolute basis, you'll see that the number of children born in America last year was the lowest in 30 years, even though there's a substantially larger population in the United States. But this isn't just occurring in the United States. Let's take a look at these dramatic changes around the world. In the UK, it took 95 years to go from the average woman having 6 children to 3. Today, it's 1.84. If we look at the United States, it took 80 years for this to occur. Bangladesh, 20, China, 11, and Iran, 10. It took only 10 years to see a 50% drop in the birth rate. And today, all of these countries are below replacement value, Bangladesh on the margins. So when you think about the world's population, if it wasn't for the extension of life, we would have had no increase in the world's population. Korea had probably the most dramatic change if you look at over time what's occurred in Korea. And then if you take a look at the world's most populous countries, India and China, you can see the dramatic drop in the birth rate. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, but one of them is the education of women And second, the increase in number of people that have moved into the middle class. There's a recent study that shows once per capita income exceeds $2,000, you have a substantial drop in the birth rate. Let's take a look at Europe and look at it a little differently. In 1951, the EU was formed. There were 8 governmental bodies associated with the EU when it was formed in 1951. And the leaders of those 8 had 32 children. Or on balance, the leaders of Germany, the Netherlands, France, Italy, and so on, UK, Belgium, had on average 4 children in 1950 for the heads of those countries. Let's take a look at it today. So today, if we look at those same 8, you will see that 7 of the 8 have never had a child. So you want to start to think about the leaders of your country who've never had a child, how they relate would be quite different than what occurred. And in this case, you've gone from 32 to 2, with only 1 of the 8 and no chance for the other 7 to have children in the future. And so this is one of the great challenges in the world today, as the leaders have different experience. Median age around the world's increasing. Today, China is a little bit below the United States, but the aging of China will be older than the United States in a few years. And if you look at United Nations projections on world population in the 21st century, you'll see here that essentially most of the growth occurs in Africa, and all the world's growth in population occurs in South Asia, coupled with Africa. So let's go to achieving the dream. Meaningful lives for everyone on the planet. The financial community plays an extremely important role in this area. And with the idea that there can't be a great life for your children or grandchildren unless everyone feels they at least had a chance. So what is this dream? Equal opportunity, not based on where you were born or where you went to school or who your parents were or your race or religion, and access to capital based on ability. There was a book written in 1931 called The Epic of America. That dream of a land in which there should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, and the opportunity to each according to their ability or their achievement. So let's take a look at a recent poll in the United States. You asked people in the United States under 30, do you believe your generation will have a better life than your parents? Take a look for about 15 seconds and ask yourself in the United States, what did people under 30 think, and how did they answer this question? A, let's take a look at the answer. So amazing when you want to think about why do only 26% of people under 30 in a nation such as the United States, or why does not only the United States, but not one country in Europe do more than 30% of the young people think they'll have a better life than their parents? What are we failing? What opportunities are we not affording them? What are the challenges for people in the financial community to change these percentages? Let's compare them with some of the percentages here in Asia. So China, 78% of everyone under 30 thinks they will have a better life. But even Turkey, Brazil, and Russia have higher scores than they do in the United States or in Western Europe. Let's take a look at the facts versus some of these opinions. Literacy rates in the world have gone from 10% to 86%. Childhood cancer survival rates in just the last less than 45 years from the high 50s to 80%. Immunization of anyone under 1 from 22% to 80% in the world. Mobile phones, potentially your bank, your doctor, your educator, 0 to 65% on the planet. This dream, if you go to Vietnam, is alive and well. 95% believe that people are better off in a market-based economy. 70% think international trade has positive effect on job creation. 50% of people under 30 in America think socialism might be a better choice than a free market society. 72% says trade helps raise their wages, and 76% have a favorable opinion of the United States. If we go to Africa, the current president of the African Union, Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda, their goal is to get what he calls the American dream, but it's the dream of Rwandans or the dream of Vietnam, to create an economic opportunities and build a culture of entrepreneurism and get people responsible for improving their lives and the feeling that they're empowered. A book a few years ago, which I would recommend you read if you get a chance, The Rational Optimist, pointed out that poverty in the world has been reduced more in the last 50 years than in the previous 500, with most of it coming in the world in the last 20 years. So at the Milken Institute, we've been very focused on this and challenged as to why do only 26% of young people in America think they're going to have a better life. And so we focused on building this center to reinforce this concept of opportunity and the dream here in Washington, D.C., across from the White House and the Treasury. Here is a brief look at that center.
The American dream is so much about creative expression and the ability to dream your life and live that dream.
I think the United States has figured out the system for making people believe. The sort of spirit that is almost in the air is that you can do whatever you put your mind to. If you're passionate about it, if you work hard for it, and if you keep at it, then there's no reason why you can't do it.
The concept of the American dream has been a concept, I think it's a global concept that through hard work, education, if you follow those paths, you will make something of your life.
My generation envisions a future in which geography and geographic borders aren't necessarily the determination of the extent of what someone can do with their lives. You don't end up with an American dream versus a French dream versus a Chinese dream. You end up with a kind of universal global dream.
8 billion people are going to have middle-class aspirations soon enough. And when that happens, the thing that will make the entire world work more effectively is if everyone can feel that there is some semblance of equality of opportunity.
The United States has exemplified, how capital provision should take place in terms of promoting innovation, promoting entrepreneurship, promoting just the pursuit of opportunity, and also supporting failure in the pursuit of success.
Creativity leads to more productivity, more innovation, and commercialization, and economic power that allows us to finance these kinds of ideals and values that we all embrace.
The best ideas and the best performing people win, regardless of your gender, regardless of your race, regardless where you came from and who you know.
When a country believes in its people and provides a platform or foundation for people to think, to dream, to grow, to practice, to fail, that's what we do.
So that's our focus. And it relies in many ways on the ability of people who work in the financial area to make sure that you've provided opportunities and everyone feels that they have a chance to succeed. It is so striking that people feel that their life is not going to be better in Europe or the United States today, considering the amazing advances that have occurred, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years. And the realization that today will be the best day for more than half the people in the world that they've ever had. And tomorrow will be the new best day for them. So I challenge you, particularly those in the financial community, to focus how we can keep this dream alive, the dream of opportunity and a better life for all of us. Thank you very much.
To conclude the summit, please welcome the panel on Working Smarter, the Future of Jobs, moderated by the Institute's President and Chief Operating Officer, Richard Ditizio.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we go to the panel, we're going to have a little bit of audience participation, so if you could all get your apps out that you've been using all day. And I'd like to call up the first polling question. Compared to when you first entered the workforce, has gender equality improved within your industry? Okay. Okay, that looks like a bit of good news. Half the people think it's better in their industries. That's great. Okay, let's call up the second question. Looks like we have a good news coming from the first. Do you think you earn the same salary as your male counterparts in similar positions? This is a little confusing because the first slide said we were moving in the right direction. So we've got 80+% say no so far. Okay. Not as much good news on this one. Let's go to the final question, the third question. Does your company release gender-specific statistics on pay, promotion, or hiring data? Okay, this is actually not surprising. Somewhere between 3/4 and 80% don't. Okay, so I wanted just to use those three questions as the backdrop. In many ways, this is a little full circle for me because it was a year ago that we had our first Women Leaders Summit here in Asia. And while the Institute had done women-specific programming, we'd never really congealed around a full day of it. And when I closed last year's, I spoke about a couple of things. I spoke about the power of language, for those of you who were here, and how organizations struggle so mightily to even address this issue given their diverse workplace. And that how even before diversity and certainly before inclusion, people talked around tolerance and how tolerance is such a lousy word because it confers a superiority and an inferiority. Nobody wants to be tolerated regardless if it's because of your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, or what might be. The second thing, I talked about the importance of being second. How we often celebrate the first glass ceiling shatterer, and they should be celebrated, but that it's actually the second person and the third person which normalizes that behavior and changes the expectation of who should come to work and who should be in leadership positions. And I noted that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in one of my favorite quotes, when she was nominated to the Supreme Court by President Clinton in 1993, made the comment that this is important because it marks the end of days that women appear in the senior-most positions one at a time. Now, unfortunately, in the 25 years that we've had in the meantime, I'm not sure that that's actually rung true. And the other thing I spoke about was about bringing your authentic self to work. 30 years ago, when I started my career on Wall Street, many of the women who were my colleagues actually dressed more like men in boxier suits and floppy ties. And you wouldn't necessarily see photographs of their children on their desk because it was not something that people generally talked about because in some way people thought it diminished their potential for their career. And like a lot of things here at the Milken Institute, we tape most of what we produce and then we put it out on YouTube and our own website, et cetera. An interesting thing happened last year. A few weeks after the conference, I started getting a lot of emails from people who had somehow seen this video of my talk. And one of which came from a woman, I'll call her Chris Collins. And I opened the email and it was paragraphs long. And Chris Collins' story was, she's a senior vice president at an investment bank in New York, and she had recently gone to an interview at a competitor. And while she's waiting in the interview room, a gentleman walks in, thinks he's in the wrong room and excuses himself and walks out. A few moments later, that same gentleman walks back in and says, "You're Chris Collins?" And she said, "I am." And he said, "Well, you've kind of thrown me. I wasn't expecting, if your name is Christine or whatever it might be, you should feel free to do that because you don't have to pretend you're someone else." And she thought, well, I thought I was here because of my qualifications on my resume. And needless to say, that interview did not go very well. But the saddest part of that is, in her paragraphs-long email to me, the thing that he made her do was actually question if she was hiding who she was. And she had never really thought of that before. And I thought, how raw must that have felt that you're willing to write a substantial email to a total stranger that you just needed to tell someone your story and be heard? And I think that that's really the point of this panel, is all of the progress that the first poll question seems to indicate, when you really look at how it's translating into real life, maybe we're not making as much progress as we think. That hadn't happened to Chris Collins 10 or 15 years ago. That happened 10 or 15 minutes ago. So I think that this is still going on today, despite all of the progress. All of these organizations have extraordinary efforts around diversity and inclusion, and somehow we're not really realizing that promise. So with that, I'd like to call the panel up, and we'll discuss this issue and the impact of technology on a changing workforce going forward. Okay. So, Dimitri, I want to start with you. As the Chief People Officer, the head of HR for S&P, how do you think about what I just said? And I know that your organization, as well as many others, have extraordinary efforts around attracting talent of all sorts of diverse pools. How do you think about women in particular? And what do you think is going to be necessary to lead in the future that maybe women have an advantage for?
Great question. I think women will have an advantage because I think about in S&P Global we've got a lot of work that's being rethought about in terms of the design of jobs, and we're doing a lot of automation, a lot of machine learning, AI, and one of the things that's coming out is that nothing's going to replace advanced cognitive capabilities. And so women actually have, and I believe, there's a lot of research around this, that the social and emotional component of the skills and that capability is something that's a lot of women have, more so than men. And it's not to say that men don't have it, men do have it, but in terms of the amount, it's definitely amplified in women. And I think that's an advantage. I think that, it rings true. Everyone should be their true self all the time, right? And this is not the time where people should try and be someone else. the more real you are, the more the warmth and the empathy that you can draw out, I think, is actually a huge advantage.
Mm-hmm. And Mary, let's turn to you, because you, coming from CAA, it's obviously a creative industry. We hear a lot about technology replacing jobs, AI is going to step in. How do you think about that in a creative field? Like, it's about acting, it's about screenwriting. I mean, what do you see the future as?
If you may allow me to talk about my company just for 2 seconds, sure. Because I think my business is very different from most of the people in this room. Creative industry is very important to what we see and what we hear every day, and we feel we have a huge sense of responsibility that we can keep up with the technology while at the same time still create better opportunities for people in our industry. Creative Artists Agency is a talent agency out of Hollywood, Los Angeles, and we represent over 6,000 clients in movie industry, television, and sports. We represent best directors in the world, such as Spielberg, James Cameron. We also represent actresses like Nicole Kidman, Jennifer Lawrence, Meryl Streep. So our business is about putting these people in the business, in movies, in television projects. We package all those content and present it to the viewers, to the audience. So what we see, the change in the landscape, as we discussed earlier, artificial intelligence, technology, internet, and streaming, how is that impacting our business? What we see is for individuals like what I have just mentioned, if you want to connect with them, one, of course, you have to see their products. The second is, if you're lucky enough, you have to get an audience from them. But that is extremely difficult, given people, or a vast majority of their fans might be in Asia or Singapore. It's nearly impossible for them to have that opportunity and travel that distance. Having them come to Asia is a big deal. They usually do that, if once a year, that's still quite a lot. So what we see is artificial intelligence and digital actually enables people to connect with them. So as a talent agency, we usually represent this person's right to direct a movie or to act in a movie. But with the technology, an individual celebrity's rights and assets will be divided to in-person, artificial, and digital asset. So if we work with the technology company to build your avatar, your fan is actually going to be able to interact with you throughout the day. You make your coffee, this person is talking to you, or you go to the internet, a streaming platform, you will hear the voice, or your whole house can be activated by your fan, like Robert Downey Jr.'s voice. So what we have to do is we have to understand what the technology means. But if we look at people who create the technology or the content, it's the brain juice behind it. The creativity is never going to be replaced by technology. That's our view.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back before careers. And Bob, you spend your day job in education with students in the classroom. One, do you observe any differences between the genders? Are people learning differently based upon their gender? And then also talk about, following up on what Mary said, how does AI and technology change education in your view?
Yeah. So on gender and education, just generally, I think gender and the ideas industry space, I'm an academic by training, but think tanks, NGOs, right? I mean, the ideas industry has really spread out of academia a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. Probably the most marked trend, and this is pretty global now, this isn't just the United States, although most of the research comes from it, is the substantial outperformance of females against males in high school and college. And there's a lot of discussion about why this is the case, right? Sort of, do females have better emotional intelligence or something like that? Is there a genetic explanation? Are males trapped by reactionary cultural scripts? Are there religious and cultural expectations that hold men back? Did feminism release a potential that we didn't know was there, and suddenly it's just bursting through institutions? I mean, there's this huge debate out there about why this is occurring, but it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear now, right? And this is valuable for a forum like this. This is valuable because this provides us with a useful natural experiment in the next generation or so to demonstrate whether or not sexism really exists. I mean, we know it exists, but here you can actually really see it in effect, right? Because you have a whole cohort of females moving through high school, university, and graduate school, outperforming their male colleagues, right? So in 20 or 30 years, these people should be running institutions basically everywhere, right? Ceteris paribus, all the things being equal, you should see females outperforming males in institutions in the next generation or so. And if they're not, that tells you that there's almost certainly some kind of like sex or gender related, cause, right? I mean, not just that, right? There are lots of other things, right? You could have another great recession that throws things up in the air, or whatever, right? But the point is you now see a sort of clear outperformance among female students that should show up later in institutions. So if you don't see greater female leadership in the future, there's a really obvious question why, right? If the meritocracy says there should be that female leadership and it's not there, right? And that's prima facie evidence of gender discrimination, right? Okay, so that's sort of the gender angle in education. That's probably the most important gender-related outcome, I think, in sort of my field broadly in the last couple decades. And the question of sort of the future and technology and stuff like that, that's even thick, that's even thornier, that's even more difficult. I think in education broadly, we're not really sure what kind of impact AI and robotics and the rest are really going to have on what we do. There have been waves of effort in the past to bring education to the classroom that have generally not been successful. In the 1950s, when television first emerged, there was a lot of talk about how people were going to be able to learn at home by watching lectures and stuff on television. And that didn't really happen, right? If any of you guys have seen the movie Quiz Show, right, to talk about how sort of like game shows kind of took over television, right? And that happened, and education was sort of driven out. People just don't watch public television. They don't watch PBS and stuff like that. It had to be subsidized by the government. And then in the 1990s and the 2000s, you had another wave of this kind of like hype about how we're going to have the internet in the classroom, right? And people were going to go to chat rooms, and we'd have distance learning and all this kind of stuff. And you would have like only half of your class would be in person, and most of your lectures would be taped, and you watch them on YouTube. And you know what? Students hate that stuff. I mean, I've done that now. It's all the wave now. So I've been pushed into doing it myself in some of my various gigs, and students just don't like it. They just don't. Administrators love it. Right? Administrators love it because they see it as cost-cutting, right? They can sort of further cut away at tenure, right? Tenure is in decline. They can further adjunctize our discipline and get rid of full-time tenure-track faculty and sort of push it onto part-timers and stuff like that. Administration loves it for cost-cutting purposes, but it's not a particularly good education tool. I'll say that. Students don't like it. They don't respond to it well, even at the master's level, right? So on technology in the future, or AI in the next 20 or 30 years, my own sense is, show me the money before I buy it. Because education, I would argue, is still basically Socratic. I mean, it really is kind of the same thing we've been doing for the last couple millennia. I really do actually mean that, right? You're mentoring young minds, you're encouraging people to read, you're encouraging people to think about new ideas, you're encouraging them to debate with one another, right? When you're 16, 17, 18, you don't know a whole lot about the world. It's good for you to have somebody around who knows more than you and shows you the ropes and teaches you things and says, this is a good book and that's not, and whatever. And that's a lot of what we do, right? Again, I just don't know. You guys know more about AI and robotics than I do. I hear these stories about how, in 30 years they'll be indistinguishable. Perhaps. But if this idea that sort of the soft human touch kinds of industries will survive AIization in the next generation, my sense is my industry will almost certainly, because we still do it Socratically. I mean, I go in there every day and I talk to students and I, take them to lunch and we sit there in office hours and we talk about their paper and they make mistakes and they do this and they do that and there are cul-de-sacs that don't work out. It's messy and sloppy and difficult. And I'm just not convinced by the futurists that kind of deep human interaction, that kind of messy human interaction can be replaced. I could be convinced of it, I could be talked into it because I don't know it so well, but I'm not sure because it's kind of been the same. The job has been basically the same since Socrates. Literally, I mean that. It literally has been the same.
Well, and there's been a number of initiatives over the years, whether it's AI today or what have you, that never really realized the full potential that people talked about in the beginning. Is what we're talking about one of those? Like, Dimitri, I wanted to go back to you. That poll in the beginning doesn't surprise me because as I travel the world and you talk to people and they say, yes, my company is very much a gender-forward company focused on equality. And then you say, well, how's your company doing on pay parity? And people say, well, I don't make as much money as my male colleagues, right? So it's counterintuitive. So I think the message is getting across. We're doing a good job at alerting people to this need for equality and leveling the playing field. I'm not sure it's translating into execution in the weeds. So how do you think about that in your business?
So firstly, for those who are, how many people from S&P Global in the room? So I've done a study in my 3 months of being there on pay parity, not just from the UK standpoint, but across the company. We pay our women just as well, and if anything, better in some cases than our male counterparts. So I'm really proud of that, and it's phenomenal. And that's it. And it really, our leadership team is behind it. I think that really is important from a pay parity standpoint. Look, it's interesting listening to you talk about the academic side as well. I think definitely certain roles that women have traditionally had are going to change, and certainly like I talked about earlier about the emotional piece, is going to be an enhancement, right, in the future. So I think when I read the studies, and there's plenty of studies around, how many people are going to be displaced with the whole automation AI piece. And I think the most recent study by McKinsey Global Institute was something like in 2030, there'll be 400 million people displaced around the globe. It's 14% of the workforce that'll be displaced. That doesn't mean that they're not able to retrain, right? But that's saying that their jobs will be gone. Now, when you think about 14% by 2030, that's not saying that it's going to be radical. It's not and that's the high-end number, not the low-end number. And so I do think that, and it's something that we're thinking about a lot. What's the impact in our workplace? Definitely the automated roles will, the data processing and data collection piece and gathering data will be definitely much more simplified. It won't exist, it'll be done by machines. And it'll allow people more time to relate to the customer and really talk with the customer and spend time with the customer, which is what our customers actually want. So the roles won't completely disappear, but it'll allow people to have the ability to spend more quality time in areas where our customers actually want more time. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's going to be something that we can look forward to, and we're actually embracing it. We're working with bots right now. We acquire companies continuously at S&P Global, acquiring the skills that we desperately want. So more data scientists, a lot more sophisticated skills. We've got Kensho, our recent acquisition, had phenomenal, sort of the greatest sort of Harvard geniuses that are in that company that we acquired, so we can actually share the knowledge. And what I'm super proud about is the 2 women in our company are leading the charge on data scientists and really skilling other employees in the workplace, and I think that's fabulous.
Mm-hmm. So Bob, I want you to put on your geopolitics hat for a moment. Following on what Dimitra said, if all of these jobs are going to be displaced, whatever the number is going to be, it's going to be millions of jobs. Just because we can automate a job away, should we? And doesn't that, what are these people going to do? And wouldn't that economic stress create unrest around the world? So couldn't we be catalyzing a catastrophic outcome by displacing all these workers?
Yeah, this is a big debate also right now in political science and economics. My general sense is from the economists to say, hey, look, comparative advantage has always worked in the past, right? The same people who complained about being displaced by combine harvesters and looms and whatever, those people are eventually recycled into the labor force. But there was always labor unrest along the way, right? And we've seen that in the past, and there's no reason not to expect it in the future. I think the bigger issue is not displacement, but the speed with which it happens, right? As you said, if it's suddenly millions of people lose their jobs in like 5 or 10 years or something. I mean, again, I'm a little bit out of my depth here because I don't actually know the robot stuff quite so well. That's not really what I do. But if it happens really radically, there's a lot in political science that says, yes, you should have pretty substantial labor unrest. If it's very concentrated in a particular sector, it's concentrated in a particular country, it's concentrated in a particular ethnic group, right? If you have some kind of really deep depth, if it looks like it's punishing one sector, one population, one group, specifically, you would imagine there would be some kind of political pushback, and that is something that my sense is governments haven't really prepared for at all. True. Certainly in the space that I work in Northeast Asia. I mean, Northeast Asia, right? You guys work out here too, right? I mean, people love tech in Korea, Japan, right? But I don't see any debate in the newspaper, certainly from the Korean government. I work in Korea. I mean, I don't see this much coming from the Korean government at all, where I do a lot of consulting. They're not preparing for this at all. And if this is really true, what you guys are telling us, if this is really going to land on us like a ton of bricks in 10 or 15 years, I don't have the sense that the government sector is prepared for that at all.
Mm-hmm. All right, I want to pivot back, Mary, and talk about what I spoke about being the first, because you are the first Asian woman to run this business here. So give us a sense of that. Like what's been more difficult for you being a woman, and what do you think has been easier that you bring to the table? And then talk about maybe some geographic differences between China and the rest of Asia.
Great. I am certainly the first female and Asian leading our company business in Greater China area. And as you can imagine, Hollywood is a very male-dominating community, and female directors' movie projects are very difficult to be funded. And our women in this business have to work extra hard to build the credential before anyone can give you a job. Because in the corporation, I'm not discounting anything that anyone says throughout the day on women's position in the company, but they can actually place you in the position. But for a female director, the box office revenue is the only thing everybody look at. If you don't have the track record, no one is going to give you the money to make the movie. So that is the realities. In CAA, we actually pay a lot of attention to our female clients. And in China, if we compare to the difference between Hollywood and China in the entertainment industry, one positive message we see or trend is in Hollywood, female actors, they get paid less compared to actors. In China, we don't actually have that problem. But the issue in China is you actually cannot find the project. Once you make your breakthrough, you're going to be equal to a lot of male in the industry. So when I took this job, a lot of people asked me, okay, you made it in this company, become the CEO in your Chinese entity, which is the JV with the Chinese private equity firm. What are you going to do about this issue in China, and how are you going to improve that? And I think, in our business, we can actually not wait for others to make the improvement. We have to bring the change to the table ourselves. So what we do is we look at our female clients. We try to bring them more opportunities. 2 examples I can give you. There is a Hong Kong film director. Her name is Kathy Yan. She was a former Wall Street Journal journalist who had this enormous passion about film. And she did some short film in the past. And last year, she brought her first long-form movie to Sundance called Dead Pigs. And nobody actually knew who she was and what the movie was about. And CAA, being the leading agency in Hollywood, signed her. And everybody couldn't understand why we did it, because we saw her gift, talent, and we know she can make a difference in the industry. And the moment we signed her, we went to Warner Brothers and DC and got her the job to direct. Well, she got the job because she is talented, but we helped her to land this deal to direct the Harley Quinn spin-off, which is going to be starred by Margot Robbie. This is going to be a huge news in the market, which was on a Hollywood Reporter, New York Times. Being the female director to direct a superhero movie, anyone in this room who has children knows what Harley Quinn means in the business. And it is a major studio film. So she made her breakthrough, and she certainly wants to replicate that success for whomever actress and talents in the industry to achieve the same level of success. The other example I can give you is actually in Singapore today, somebody told me they watched that movie. It's called Us and Them, which is a Chinese film written by our client, who is the writer, Yuan Yuan. She only did 1 movie before, and we saw her film, which was very, very unique. It's an indie film. And so she wrote the script for Us and Them, and the director is actually a first-time director. It's her debut film, Renee Liu. She's a singer from Taiwan, and she wanted to direct a film. And the box office was 1.3 billion renminbi over 2 weekends. And Yuan Yuan now sees the success in this. She was very grateful to the project, and she now oversees 20 films and web series development projects, trying to place female clients in those projects. And I think those are the message and mechanism as a talent agency can bring to the market, that we can actually create those changes instead of waiting for others to give opportunities to women.
Okay. So Ditizio, how do you think about, I'm sure we were speaking before, you can attract talent in from all quarters. How do you create career paths so that you don't have that precipitous drop-off in the senior-most ranks that we see? I mean, if you looked at the Fortune 500 today, some 52% of the workforce is female, And as you go up the seniority ranks, you get to the end, and there's less than 5% are CEOs. So something is happening. Like what do you think is happening, and what is S&P trying to do to prevent it?
So we're looking at that right now. So it definitely drops off for us a little bit as well. Not as drastic as 5%. Thankfully, we've got about a third of our women in the senior executive team right now. But we have predominantly, when you think about the top 150 executives in our company, it's a really healthy number. I think it's about 40-odd%, which is much stronger than even our entry-level roles. I think what we are looking at is, obviously everyone across the world is thinking about flexibility and making sure the workplace is actually a really easy place for people to be able to have families and careers, or caregivers and careers. But beside that, I think we're investing a lot in reskilling our people as well. So we've got obviously significant investment in leadership programs for women and for men, but predominantly our CEOs wanting to make sure that our women are given some opportunities that perhaps they haven't had in the past. I think there's a lot of, we've had something like over 55% of our employees have taken on this year just the AI training and automation skills, so they can actually skill themselves and learn more about that space. Again, uptake from a female standpoint is much higher. We find that there are women wanting to really accelerate, and I don't know if it's sort of the academic piece that you're talking about. They're wanting to learn. There's an appetite to learn. They don't want to fall behind, and so there is definitely a desire to continually thrive in that area. So I think from a career standpoint, we encourage a lot of our women to go overseas, mobilize themselves and learn and take on short-term assignments and long-term assignments. We have, I know a lot of companies out there have that today as well, but we want to make sure that we have a community of women that also supports women. We have a fantastic group called WINS in our organization that does phenomenal work in supporting and driving the development of females in our workplace. And it's things like, having guest speakers come along, sharing stories, making sure that people really understand some of the challenges, and just creating a really strong network within the organization. That is actually a global network that's not just, US-centric. It's actually got local chapters that are driven and incredibly successful. And I think that community feel is really important. So I think it's beyond the training, beyond pay. The community piece is, really does help the development of females.
Okay. So Mary, let's go to you. CAA, Hollywood. I think we'd be remiss not to address Me Too and Time's Up, since it's bubbling up heavily there. What do you think precipitated that inside the industry? And what is the industry doing to correct so that it doesn't happen again?
Well, certainly it has brought a lot of attention to people in the industry and brought a lot of positive changes in Hollywood and in the movie industry overall. We see a little bit of that same movement in China right now. But as I talk to some of the female executives, we have our Me Too discussion all the time. And recently I was with a group of female business leaders, and one of them actually, who is the chairman of an investment bank in Greater China, and she said, I actually don't like this discussion because I would like to think I'm capable enough to earn this job myself, not because of movement, that somebody is giving me that job. That's a very interesting perspective, because I think, in certain companies, people start looking at gender diversity, the percentage of female leadership in the company, the number of women on the board, which is all very positive. But I think also at the same time, I support her view by saying we actually worked very hard. We are as gifted as our male colleagues, and we actually went to that position by proving our capability instead of being given the job through a movement. So that is a very interesting perspective. And what I see in China right now is the attention on gender equality is obviously very high, but compared to other countries, not because I'm from China, I think gender equality hasn't really been a real issue. The real issue is it's kind of difficult to have the opportunities in the market because some women will naturally assume certain industries are not for them. Just like, when I talk about AI technology, if you look at Tim Cook, Mark Zuckerberg, we tend to forget Angela and Sheryl behind those success. So we need to think about it ourselves. We need to fight for our opportunities, not just through a movement. Every day we have to think about it, our own capability.
I think what's interesting about what you just said, and echoing what you said earlier about having to work so hard, is that I don't think over the course of my career I've ever had someone say, oh, I got that job because I was a Caucasian male, right? Only because that, I was a straight white guy and that's why I got the job. And I think it's interesting that women even today have that perspective. And it goes back to who are you expecting to fill this role, right? If your expectation and your norm is that straight white guy, then everybody else who comes is other. And by being other, you need to prove yourself even more so as if you don't deserve to be there. And I think that it goes back to that notion of language. It's how we talk about it that it really matters. And I think we need to instill this in younger and younger people. Bob, when you think of the younger people, you're dealing with teenagers now, right? They haven't even figured anything out yet. Is there a sense, I was thinking back, when I graduated from grad school, the cohort was probably 50% men, 50% women. But if I were to look today, 30 years later, about how many of those women are still on Wall Street, it might be 5. Right? So at that age, when I'm expecting a level playing field, regardless of my gender, does that ever come up? Are young girls today thinking they might have a restricted career because of their gender, or it doesn't even enter the conversation?
Certainly in Asia, in East Asia where I operate, in Northeast Asia, right, this is a big issue, right? I get lots and lots of female students who outperform male students. It's really obvious. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and the women sit in the front rows, and they're awake, and they're focused, and they got a pen in their hand, and they're like, Dr. Kelly, I'm ready to go. And in the back, my men are pulling their baseball caps down, and sleeping, and they were drinking the night before. Really, it's the gender gap in favor of females is really, really noticeable now. It actually kind of worrisome that males are so dysfunctional and I'm not really, no, I really mean that. I'm actually sort of a little bit, I understand, I feel like a woman, I kind of understand it's they have it coming, but, it is actually sort of not good over the long term that you get this really noticeable I don't know, we should be worried about what's happening to young males, to be honest. No, really, we should, as an educator, we don't know what's going on. We don't know how to connect to those guys in the back of the room who were drinking last night, wearing their baseball caps and playing on their phone. That's a real problem. I know how to connect to the smart, bright woman in the front who's awake and alert and showered and whatever. No, really, trust me, come do my job. You'll see what I'm talking about, right? But then your point is well taken, though, right? So they finish out, right? They go through the institutions. They come out of graduate school at 2025, right? They got the degree. And then at least, in East Asia, right? You guys are all out here, too. You guys know this, right? They crash into these sort of fairly constricted social expectations, particularly about motherhood, right? My wife has got a master's degree, and we got 2 kids, and that basically forced my wife out of her career. We want to find domestic help. It's very hard to do in Korea. Korea's got all kinds of restrictions. Japan does too about foreign assistance and things like that. And certainly in Asia, that is my sense, is that there's sort of this sort of lingering, I don't know what you want to call it, Confucian or traditional or patriarchal, whatever, expectation about motherhood, where that drives females out of institutions or encourages them not to go forward. And I get lots and lots of female students who come to me and ask me this kind of stuff, right? And they're like, oh, I want to get a career, and my boyfriend and his parents and stuff like that. And I never really quite know what to say, because we have that in my own family too. I want my wife to have a career, and she really wants to have a career, but we have 2 kids, and who's going to take care of them, right? We don't live around my family. Yeah. Yeah. You probably don't want that, right? You guys saw the video, right? You don't want me taking care of my kids. But it is so, right? So that's what happens, right? It ends up being sort of balanced in between, and we're juggling, and I'm flying here and there, and she's doing this, and it's just a real tangle. My sense is at least in modernizing Asian economies, this question of sort of like allowing women to participate in the workforce and also pursue motherhood is something that requires not just like the gender ministry, but like a broad-based effort, particularly at the corporate level, to find it easier, find ways to make it easier for women to do both of these things, right? And then obviously what you really want to work for, of course, is gender equality in child rearing, but
I think that
the motherhood is the big block with the students that I see.
Yeah.
But Dimitri brings up a good point, right? It should be parenthood, not motherhood, right? I think that if we start reframing that dialogue, that there's two parents here, right? And so, like when I think about it, and maybe I'm naive though, but it does seem that once the baby's born, right, the gender-specific part of it's over. Right, so we can't change that part, but once the baby's out, right, I think that it's equal footing. So what can corporations do? Like Dimitri, what should S&P Global, what are they doing around that parenting issue?
So we have a parents networking group as well. Look, I'm a mother, with 2 kids, and I have had a fantastic career, and I feel like I'm a great mum too, right? I mean, you can have both. I'm sort of like, you can't, it's not one or the other. And I think, it depends. I know that, some people differ on that, but I feel like you can strive, and you've got to have role models in the workplace. You've got to have them. You've got to have people, I found that scary, right? The politicians that aren't having kids, it's really scary. They're completely losing touch with maybe their constituents, right? But the people. But also, I think people are sort of feeling like they can't travel. You can't juggle high-powered roles. You can. I think you need to make sure, and I say this to women all the time that I work with, is select your boss. Pick your boss. Make sure you have the best manager, the best leader, that you can actually have a life and have a career. Because if you have a really shocking leader, manager, then you've got no hope in actually being able to juggle all the things you want to juggle. And I think you need a really supportive leader. You also need to make sure you've got great sponsors around that, that support you. We talked about the network that we have at S&P. We've got a number of community groups, the women's group, the parents group. I have tons of them that help really foster a support network and act as a development channel for people as well, which I think is great. And they have been well and truly in place for many years, which I think is fantastic. So, of course, you can have flexible working practices. You can have wonderful parent policies, right? I call them caring policies, because some people don't have children. They have I have aging parents. I'm flying to see my mother on the weekend, to spend some time with her, because she's old. Like, I hate to say it, but I'm old too. Okay, so I think that's we have to be understanding. We have to be compassionate. I think that we have lost our compassion, and we have to bring the caring, compassionate piece back into the workplace. Have to have that, because without that, we're losing touch with humanity.
And Mary, should...
I have children too.
Yes, okay. How should Hollywood, in addition to the work that you're doing on promoting female directors, actresses, et cetera, on the representation side, right? Is there enough coming out of Hollywood that shows positive role models of women in these kinds of roles, where you can be balancing it all?
You mean family and career? Well, I think, we can think of a few examples who have been extremely successful in their career, but also have a very good family life, like Nicole Kidman is one of them, Meryl Streep is one of them. There are a whole bunch of male clients who have the same balance, but the reality is, it is the challenge. When you're shooting a movie for 6 months outside of the United States, you have to come up with a way to look after your children. When they are younger, you can bring them with you. When they are older, certainly they have school to go to, and some of them they choose. I was talking to one of the talents today. When she goes on music tour, we represent a lot of music talents too. If she does like 30 shows in 6 months, that means she's on the road all the time. She can only go home over the weekend, and she goes home and she flies out again, Thursday and do the rehearsal on Friday, do the show on Saturday, goes home on Sunday, be with the children. It is just tough. It's tough for them. It's very tough for us as well because we're in a service industry. We're expected to be available 24/7, and we have to figure out a way to balance our family life. And I can write the whole book about it, but it's difficult. There's no answer or handbook as to how you can do that. As much as we can, in the company, we try to establish our support network that parents can share experiences and also resources together. But it's an issue that women always have to deal with. I kind of disagree that men cannot play a role because I see a lot of men taking more responsibilities in educating their children when the mother is traveling on the road all the time. Personally, I'm one of them as well. My husband works, but we share responsibilities. I'm traveling half of the week all the time, and he does some travels too, and we try to match our schedule, and that's the only way to make it work. And I see many of my colleagues do the same.
Okay. Well, I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience. So I have a couple that have come up through the app. So if you have a question, please put it through. So this one will speak to the idea of automation. It says, with job automation, will people spend more time on client interaction, or will companies just take the profits? I'm assuming that they're thinking there's going to be a lot more profits once these jobs are automated away. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. I think that definitely in our case, we're hoping that our people can actually shift and spend more time with the clients. I think that's really important. I do think the reality is that some jobs will disappear, right? Some will. I mean, those that have got 100% of processing data or gathering data, they may disappear. But if there's a portion of people's jobs, if that disappears, then it gives people opportunity to really then focus on another portion. And I think clients will have an expectation that is much higher than what they have today too, because they know that the automation piece is in, and that people have got the ability. You can't just say, hey, I'm processing your data. I'm trying to gather the information, right? They know that robots are there doing that right now. It's not even the future of work. It's right now. This is happening right now in the workplace. And it's changing, it's shifting.
I also think that if you think about the jobs which are going to unfold in the future, it's going to require a digital fluency that many parts of the world don't have right now. So as we start thinking back to the potential geopolitical disruption that might unfold, right? If all of a sudden the jobs I need, I'm not skilled for, and I come from a very poor part of the world to start with, right? You can just see that devolving pretty rapidly. Okay, well, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. Are there any other questions in the audience that you want to just ask?
There's one there.
Yes.
I'm curious if in other countries, I totally agree with what you said, you're talking about where women just are better, and then just when we look forward in your careers. Is it different in other countries? I know a lot about Sweden, because you read a lot about that difference, but is it different in Asia? Is it different in Latin America? Sorry. Could you hear any of that?
Yeah, I heard it. We heard
You
it.
speaking to me or?
All of us.
Anybody?
Do you want to go for that or?
Well, I can speak on education. I'm not in your sector. I'm sort of non-profit. But in education, the outperformance of males against females against males is pretty universal now. It's basically everywhere. I mean, I do stuff in the U.S. I do with U.S. students and Asian students. We get a lot of foreign students at my university and stuff like that. I'm teaching a graduate class right now with students from China and Vietnam and a couple other places, and they're all females. I mean, it's really noticeable now. It's really noticeable, and it's fairly universal.
Is that translated to leadership and later on? Are there more leaders? Are there more women in business? Sounds like your mother comment.
I personally think that, and look, I've lived and worked in France. I live in the US, I'm Australian, I've lived in Australia, I've lived in Asia. I actually think that it is a global phenomenon, right? It is a problem universally. And I think that we need to find more than just the parenthood excuse as the reason why people aren't returning or taking that leap forward to take those jobs. So, I mean, we've definitely seen increases, over time, and definitely in the last 5 years, a lot more women sort of not dropping out of the workforce and taking less of a step back. But this whole notion of sort of dialing up and dialing down is always a good one. But it seems to be that women do that more than men, right? So men rarely dial back. Rarely do they dial down.
I'm going to give it to my friend next, but one thing we've observed, and I've started a group in New York called More to Go for financial women primarily, is that there's this kind of early 30s when women drop out more, a lot because of kids, but a lot just because they can. And I observe, like, your early 30s, your career just sucks. Like, you're managing up, you're managing down, you're not paid well. And if you're given the option, it's kind of a Sheryl Sandberg point, but if you're given the option to step out, like, a lot of people would, and kind of keeping women at that point when we've already invested so much in them is what I'm really focused on.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I would also say that quality childcare is so expensive, and when you're in your 20s or even later 20s and early 30s, the cost of childcare is so prohibitive that I think you see a lot of women at that point step out because they can't see the future value of what they're sacrificing. And it actually makes sense to pay your baby nurse or your nanny more than you're earning for the next year or two until you get back to the workforce in force, and then you can, create your full potential later on. So I think that's another really hard thing to deal with.
My mother-in-law was the best. Be friends with your mother-in-law, like seriously, and take them with you around the globe. It helps.
All right, we have another one here. This is about an S&P report, actually. S&P Gender Pay Gap report in the UK showed 24.5% of women are in the top quartile of pay, yet 58% in the bottom.
Yeah.
How is S&P addressing that lack of female representation in higher paid roles?
So my comment earlier was really about the global. I looked at the whole women pay gap issue, and we don't have an issue when I look at the average across all sectors, all levels for men and women. In the UK specifically, we have some challenges that we have an action plan that's actually on the website, and we are literally addressing that. The easiest thing is to just address the pay issue up front as people come in, rather than trying to play catch up all the time. I think you've got to, people need to start to say, okay, what am I paying my guys? What am I paying my females? And making that choice very early on to pay the right amount to begin with, and not shortchange women. I think we specifically are making sure that we do that right in the beginning, but we're also putting aside some money to actually address some of the gaps that we have, and we are going to continually increase and improve that so we can reduce the gap, particularly in the UK. But overall, when you look at all across the globe, we have really great pay parity.
We have, at the Institute, at our global conference this year, we had an entire track on equality, and at the conclusion of that, I announced a challenge to the Fortune 500 to be transparent about their gender pay.
Yeah.
So only 4% of those companies actually release full statistics across diversity and pay. So I think as a neutral arbiter, the Milken Institute can step in and request that data. And it'll be interesting to see what the responses so far are slip. Okay, one more question here. We have, it's apparent that women are capable and want to be seen and treated as equal. In your respective industries, are young women starting to advocate for themselves? Do you see a generational difference? Mary, do you see it? Like younger women versus women who've been in the workforce for
I
some
think
time?
the younger generation tend to notice these differences a lot quicker because of the education. And in our company, most of the young employees, female employees, they're educated in United States or in UK. So they actually realize these issues compared to their peers in China a lot faster, and they want to voice out. And when you guys were talking about the difference among different countries, what I have noticed is, there are two sets of difference. One is in the West. I feel female leadership or female employees tend to advocate for the equal rights. And in Asia, I feel women work extra hard to prove themselves or prove their values. That is the dynamics I have seen. The second is I think Asians are less advocate about all these issues. And so what we encourage them is we need to discuss this openly and bring the issues to the table and discuss with the key stakeholders in the company and try to solve that. So the young employees in CAA China, 80% of the employees are women. And we told our young students, or they came out, usually they came out of graduate school and joined CAA. So we told them, just be observant of what our company culture is and tell us how we can improve it. And less of them actually focus on the gender issue, but in US, there is a huge discussion about female equality among younger assistants.
Okay. So we're almost out of time. Let's go, we'll do a quick lightning round. What is the one thing that you think could change about gender equality that you'd like to see 10 years from now if we were to have this panel again? It would be done and move the needle.
Oh, I'd like to see more than one thing. One thing that would change. I mean, I'd love to see more men here, for example. I mean, that would be good, that it's not just women driving women issues. I think it's great that there's a couple of guys here, but I think it should be a lot
Flailing.
you know, but in all honesty, I'd like us not to be talking about it because it's actually, we're living it, right? Just let's not talk about it in 5 to 10 years' time. Wouldn't that be great?
That'd be great.
5 years would be really acceptable.
All right, Bob?
I think probably the most important public policy choice or option out there for us is to make it easier for motherhood, parenthood, right? So that the kinds of choices we were talking about before are not foisted just on women or just on men, but all of us, right? I mean, as you guys said, right, the men should be a part of this as well. Where I operate, there's sort of these cultural expectations that women are going to do more of it. That's a problem too. Public policy can push back on that by trying to make it easier. Certainly in my job, when we had kids, I got no notification whatsoever from the Korean government or Korean institutions that I could in fact take paternal leave. I only found out 5 years later that I could do that. I was like, I could? Well, no one even bothered to tell me because the cultural expectation is men just never quit their job, right? I work 60 hours a week, right? That needs to change, right? That Korean birth rate that Michael Milken put up, it's even lower today. It's below 1.0 live births per female, right? The Korean population is simply fading away because women want to have jobs and they're being told that you have to be either mothers or have a job, and they're increasingly choosing to keep their job. If you do that, you're going to get that kind of outcome, and that is just politically and socially unsustainable, right? I mean, you don't want to have your young people just disappearing because no one wants to have babies, and public policy has simply got to change. You've got to force the corporates, you've got to force institutions like my own. My university provides no daycare at all, nothing. We do nothing if you have kids. Zippo, right? You want us to, right? You want people to have kids, and the public policy has got to push the private sector to make it easier for all of us.
Okay. Mary?
What we should do today to improve it, I think, is the transparency and also access to information in the company as to how we are making improvement for women in terms of equal opportunity. The pay is one thing, the promotional opportunities, whether women can sit on the board, whether there will be a diversity committee. If we have full transparency to that, I think things can improve tremendously.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank our panel. I want to leave you with where we started, which is on a note of optimism from that first poll question about gender. And I think I love this quote that Hillary Clinton had during the election. She said that my mother was born before women in the United States had the right to vote. And my daughter just voted for her mother to be president of the United States. So change does happen, just not as quickly as you'd like sometimes. But I want to thank you all, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.